Chapter when alive again? Then show me where he is. I'll give £1,000 to look upon him. Shakespeare. In the autumn of 1816, John Melmoth, a student in Trinity College, Dublin, quitted it to attend a dying uncle on whom his hopes for independence chiefly rested. John was the orphan son of a younger brother, whose small property scarce could pay John's college expenses. But the uncle was rich, unmarried, and old, and John, from his infancy, had been brought up to look on him with that mingled sensation of awe and of the wish, without the means to conciliate, that sensation at once attractive and repulsive, with which we regard a being who, as nurse, domestic, and parent, have tutored us to believe, holds the very threads of our existence in his hands, and may prolong or snap them when he pleases. On receiving this summons, John set immediately out to attend his uncle. The beauty of the country through which he traveled, it was the County Wicklow, could not prevent his mind from dwelling on many painful thoughts, some borrowed from the past, and more from the future. His uncle's caprice and moroseness, the strange reports concerning the cause of the secluded life he had led for many years, his own dependent state, fell like blows fast and heavy on his mind. He roused himself to repel them, sat up in the mail, in which he was a solitary passenger, looked out on the prospect, consulted his watch. Then he thought they receded for a moment. But there was nothing to fill their place, and he was forced to invite them back for company. When the mind is thus active in calling over invaders, no wonder the conquest is soon completed. As the carriage drew near the lodge, the name of old Melmoth's seat, John's heart grew heavier every moment. The recollection of this awful uncle from infancy, when he was never permitted to approach him without innumerable lectures, not to be troublesome, not to go too near his uncle, not to ask him any questions, on no account to disturb the inviolable arrangement of his snuff-box, handbell, and spectacles, nor to suffer the glittering of the gold-headed cane to tempt him to the mortal sin of handling it, and, finally, to pilot himself aright through his perilous course in and out of the apartment without striking against the piles of books, globes, old newspapers, wig blocks, tobacco pipes, and snuff canisters, not to mention certain hidden rocks of rat traps and moldy books beneath the chairs, together with the final reverential bow at the door, which was to be closed with cautious gentleness, and the stairs to be descended as if he were shod with felt. This recollection was carried on to his schoolboy years, when at Christmas and Easter, the ragged pony, the jest of the school, was dispatched to bring the reluctant visitor to the lodge, where his pastime was to sit vis-a-vis to his uncle, without speaking or moving, till the pair resembled Don Raymond and the ghost of Beatrice in the Monk. Then watching him as he picked the bones of lean mutton out of his mess of weak broth, the latter of which he handed to his nephew with a needless caution not to take more than he liked, then hurried to bed by daylight, even in winter, to save the expense of an inch of candle, where he lay awake and restless from hunger, till his uncle's retiring at 8 o'clock gave signal to the gouvernante of the meager household to steal up to him with some fragments of her own scanty meal, administering between every mouthful a whispered caution not to tell his uncle. Then his college life passed in an attic in the second square, uncheered by an invitation to the country. The gloomy summer wasted in walking up and down the deserted streets, as his uncle would not defray the expenses of his journey. The only intimation of his existence, received in quarterly epistles, containing, with the scanty but punctual remittance, complaints of the expenses of his education, cautions against extravagance, and lamentations for the failure of tenants and the fall of the value of lands. All these recollections came over him, and along with them, the remembrance of that last scene, where his dependence on his uncle was impressed on him by the dying lips of his father. "John, I must leave you, my poor boy. It has pleased God to take your father from you before he could do for you what would have made this hour less painful to him. You must look up, John, to your uncle for everything. He has oddities and infirmities, but you must learn to bear with them, and with many other things too, as you will learn too soon. And now, my poor boy, may he who is the father of the fatherless look on your desolate state, and give you favor in the eyes of your uncle." As this scene rose to John's memory, his eyes filled fast with tears, which he hastened to wipe away as the carriage stopped to let him out at his uncle's gate. He alighted, and with a change of linen and a handkerchief, his only traveling equipment, he approached his uncle's gate. The lodge was in ruins, and a barefooted boy from an adjacent cabin ran to lift on its single hinge what had once been a gate, but was now a few planks so villainously put together that they clattered like a sign in a high wind. The stubborn post of the gate, yielding at last to the united strength of John and his barefooted assistant, grated heavily through the mud and gravel stones, in which it left a deep and sloughy furrow, and the entrance lay open. John, after searching his pocket in vain for a trifle to reward his assistant, pursued his way, while the lad, on his return, cleared the road at a hop, step, and jump, plunging through the mud with all the dabbling and amphibious delight of a duck, and scarce less proud of his agility than of his sarving a gentleman. As John slowly trod the miry road which had once been the approach, he could discover, by the dim light of an autumnal evening, signs of increasing desolation since he had last visited the spot. Signs that penury had been aggravated and sharpened into downright misery. There was not a fence or a hedge round the domain, an uncemented wall of loose stones, whose numerous gaps were filled with furze or thorns, supplied their place. There was not a tree or shrub on the lawn. The lawn itself was turned into pasture ground, and a few sheep were picking their scanty food amid the pebble stones, thistles, and hard mold, through which a few blades of grass made their rare and squalid appearance. The house itself stood strongly defined even amid the darkness of the evening sky, for there were neither wings, or offices, or shrubbery, or tree, to shade or support it, and soften its strong, harsh outline. John, after a melancholy gaze at the grass-grown steps and boarded windows, addressed himself to knock at the door. But knocker there was none. Loose stones, however, there were in plenty, and John was making vigorous application to the door with one of them, till the furious barking of a mastiff, who threatened at every bound to break his chain, and whose yell and growl, accompanied by eyes that glow and fangs that grin, savored as much of hunger as of rage, made the assailant raise the siege on the door and betake himself to a well-known passage that led to the kitchen. A light glimmered in the window as he approached. He raised the latch with a doubtful hand, but when he saw the party within, he advanced with the step of a man no longer doubtful of his welcome. Round a turf fire, whose well-replenished fuel gave testimony to the master's indisposition, who would probably as soon have been placed on the fire himself as seen the whole kish emptied on at once, were seated the old housekeeper, 2 or 3 followers, people who ate, drank, and lounged about in any kitchen that was open in the neighborhood, on an occasion of grief or joy, all for his honor's sake, and for the great respect they bore the family. And an old woman, whom John immediately recognized as the doctress of the neighborhood, a withered sibyl, who prolonged her squalid existence by practicing on the fears, the ignorance, and the sufferings of beings as miserable as herself. Among the better sort, to whom she sometimes had access by the influence of servants, she tried the effects of some simples, her skill in which was sometimes productive of success. Among the lower orders she talked much of the effects of the evil eye, against which she boasted a counterspell, of unfailing efficacy. And while she spoke, she shook her grizzled locks with such witch-like eagerness that she never failed to communicate to her half-terrified, half-believing audience some portion of that enthusiasm which, amid all her consciousness of imposture, she herself probably felt a large share of. Still, when the case at last became desperate, when credulity itself lost all patience, and hope and life were departing together, she urged the miserable patient to confess. There was something about his heart, and when this confession was extorted from the weariness of pain and the ignorance of poverty, she nodded and muttered so mysteriously as to convey to the bystanders that she had had difficulties to contend with which were invincible by human power, when there was no pretext, from indisposition, for her visiting either his honor's kitchen or the cotter's hut. When the stubborn and persevering convalescence of the whole country threatened her with starvation, she still had a resource. If there were no lives to be shortened, there were fortunes to be told. She worked by spells, and by such dobry as is beyond our element. No one twined so well as she the mystic yarn to be dropped into the lime kiln pit, on the edge of which stood the shivering inquirer into futurity, doubtful whether the answer to her question of who holds was to be uttered by the voice of demon or lover. No one knew so well as she to find where the four streams met, in which, on the same portentous season, the chemise was to be immersed and then displayed before the fire, in the name of one whom we dare not mention to ears polite, to be turned by the figure of the destined husband before morning. No one but herself, she said, knew the hand in which the comb was to be held, while the other was employed in conveying the apple to the mouth, while, during the joint operation, the shadow of the phantom spouse was to pass across the mirror before which it was performed. No one was more skillful or active in removing every iron implement from the kitchen where these ceremonies were usually performed by the credulous and terrified dupes of her wizardry, lest, instead of the form of a comely youth exhibiting a ring on his white finger, an headless figure should stalk to the rack, anglicé, dresser, take down a long spit, or, in default of that, snatch a poker from the fireside, and mercilessly take measure with its iron length of the sleeper for a coffin. No one, in short, knew better how to torment or terrify her victims into a belief of that power which may and has reduced the strongest minds to the level of the weakest, and under the influence of which the cultivated skeptic, Lord Lyttelton, yelled and gnashed and writhed in his last hours, like the poor girl who, in the belief of the horrible visitation of the vampire, shrieked aloud that her grandfather was sucking her vital blood while she slept, and expired under the influence of imaginary horror. Such was the being to whom old Melmoth had committed his life, half from credulity, and, Hibernicé speaking, more than half from avarice. Among this group John advanced, recognizing some, disliking more, distrusting all. The old housekeeper received him with cordiality. He was always her white-headed boy, she said. Imprimis, his hair was as black as jet. And she tried to lift her withered hand to his head with an action between a benediction and a caress, till the difficulty of the attempt forced on her the conviction that that head was 14 inches higher than her reach since she had last patted it. The men, with the national deference of the Irish to a person of superior rank, all rose at his approach, their stools chattering on the broken flags, and wished his honor 1,000 years and long life to the back of that, and would not his honor take something to keep the grief out of his heart? And so saying, 5 or 6 red and bony hands tendered him glasses of whiskey all at once. All this time the Sibyl sat silent in the ample chimney corner, sending redoubled whiffs out of her pipe. John gently declined the offer of spirits, received the attentions of the old housekeeper cordially, looked askance at the withered crone who occupied the chimney corner, and then glanced at the table, which displayed other cheer than he had been accustomed to see in his honor's time. There was a wooden dish of potatoes, which old Melmoth would have considered enough for a week's subsistence. There was the salted salmon, a luxury unknown even in London, vide Miss Edgeworth's Tales, the absentee. There was the slink veal, flanked with tripe. And finally, there were lobsters and fried turbot enough to justify what the author of the tale asserts, suo periculo, that when his great-grandfather, the Dean of Killala, hired servants at the deanery, they stipulated that they should not be required to eat turbot or lobster more than twice a week. There were also bottles of Wicklow ale, long and surreptitiously borrowed from his honor's cellar, and which now made their first appearance on the kitchen hearth, and manifested their impatience of further constraint by hissing, spitting, and bouncing in the face of the fire that provoked its animosity. But the whiskey, genuine illegitimate potsheen, smelling strongly of weed and smoke, and breathing defiance to excisemen, appeared, the veritable amphitryon of the feast. Everyone praised, and drank as deeply as he praised. Repeating the action, probably excited by the effect she had produced, and then sunk on her seat, resumed her pipe, and spoke no more. At this moment of involuntary awe on the part of John, and of terrified silence on that of the rest, an unusual sound was heard in the house, and the whole company started as if a musket had been discharged among them. It was the unwonted sound of old Melmoth's bell. His domestics were so few, and so constantly near him that the sound of his bell startled them as much as if he had been ringing the knell for his own interment. "He used always to rap down for me," said the old housekeeper, hurrying out of the kitchen. "He said pulling the bells wore out the ropes." The sound of the bell produced its full effect. The housekeeper rushed into the room, followed by a number of women, the Irish préfets, all ready to prescribe for the dying or weep for the dead, all clapping their hard hands or wiping their dry eyes. These hags all surrounded the bed, and to witness their loud, wild, and desperate grief, their cries of, "Oh, he's going, his honor's going, his honor's going." One would have imagined their lives were bound up in his, like those of the wives in the story of Sinbad the Sailor, who were to be interred alive with their deceased husbands. 4 of them wrung their hands and howled round the bed, while one, with all the adroitness of a Mrs. Quickly, felt his honor's feet, and upward, and all was cold as any stone.